Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yvette Kelly with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Text Messaging Guidelines for Behavioral Health Providers Part 2 webinar. If you did not have the opportunity to join us for Part 1, you can find the slides and recording on our website, ctacny.org. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Ann Cuppinger and Connor McCollum, who will be assisting to make sure the webinar runs smoothly. And before we get started, I do want to take a few minutes to review some housekeeping items. The slides and recording will be made available within the next couple of days, so anyone who would like to review this content at a later date will be able to do so. We will also devote some time at the end of today's presentation for questions and answers. So we are asking participants to please submit questions at any point during the webinar. Please utilize the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions. Also, if you could please remember to use the drop-down box to chat to all panelists, that will help us make sure that we don't overlook any questions. Our presenter today will do his best to address as many questions in the time permitted. But just a quick note that if there are questions that are New York State specific, it may not be able to be addressed here, or especially as it pertains to specific regulations. So just want to let folks know that. There are also several helpful resources that will be posted along with the slides and recording. So Roy Huggins, who's our presenter today, was an independent web developer before making the transition to a therapy private practice. He quickly found the mental health profession needed expert guidance on technology topics. And since 2010, Roy has continuously worked to expand his understanding of his colleagues' needs and stay up to date with the ever-evolving digital world. He regularly consults on issues relating to technology and therapy practice. He shared a lot of great information during Part 1, and today we're just looking to continue that conversation. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Roy to get us started.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Let's jump in where we ended off last time. And specifically, the wonderful folks at CTAC sent me a list of your questions that were in the chat last time that were unanswered. And I want to address a couple of these questions to help illustrate stuff we talked about last time to make sure it's real clear. Because I got a feeling there's a couple of clarification points that I think are essential for helping everyone to understand two very important things. One of those very important things is that texting is totally doable in some form or another. Exactly what form is good for you and your agency, though, depends on a number of factors. And so I was introducing those factors. So I want to make sure people are clear on those factors because it's pretty essential to understanding how to set up a solution for you that allows you to do texting, meet clients where they are, work with populations that may need you to text in a way that keeps you HIPAA compliant and ethical, right? So it's completely doable. Pretty much any agency context or private practice context should be able to use some form of texting. So let me review some of these questions to help ensure everyone gets the pieces of that so we can get to that solution-making piece. So there's a couple questions. So someone asked what I think is a very reasonable question. The way they framed it is kind of funny, or I like it. The question is it wrong that I prefer texting reminders? So these are appointment reminders, and I prefer them by text because it saves me time as opposed to calling. The clinician making sure they get texting reminders as opposed to phone reminders because text reminders save time. Is that wrong? I love that the question was asked because the question frames things in a way that, certainly I can answer in terms of legal, ethical topics and issues, right? I could talk about what ethics codes say. I could talk about what HIPAA says. And those would generally say, no, it's not wrong as long as you do it right. I mean, that's what they would say. But I love the question because it also kind of includes that piece of, am I doing something wrong or am I not being the best clinician? And I think what I want to say is I don't think you are being a bad clinician at all by feeling that way. And there's a couple of reasons there. One is that we have a lot to do, especially if you're working in a public agency. You usually have more to do than is really reasonable for an individual clinician in those contexts. Even in private practice, you usually have more to do than is really reasonable. And so wanting to save time is not an unreasonable thing. And in this context, the desire to save time by using texting is also far from unreasonable because texting is a very normal thing for us socially. right? So like this is where we run into the interesting differences between the social world around us and our professional world, because there are some significant differences. Like we think about things in ways that we don't think about when we're outside the office. And so one of those actually is security issues. Like, if someone were to ask me about a client of mine, I wouldn't answer by saying, well, I can't talk about that person, or, oh, no, my clients are private. I'd give them an answer that just basically doesn't confirm or deny that anyone of any particular name is my client, right? It's a very strange way of responding to a question or an inquiry, but it's what we do, right? So we do some things in a way that are socially weird. So it makes sense that you're asking, is it wrong that I want to do texting reminders just because it saves me time? Like, is this a thing that makes me not thinking about texting in the proper way for a therapist to want to save time by using texting? Or is it just natural that as a modern human and modern American, that's how I want to do things? I think the reality is tending towards perfectly reasonable, although there are issues there that are relevant to us as therapists when we're thinking about time-saving measures. Because certainly there are some time-saving measures that everyday people use that we couldn't use. Like, for example, I could make things real efficient by putting my file cabinet in the waiting room and just having my clients' names written really big Sharpie on the outside of their folders, because I still use paper records, by the way, everybody. So like, I could put that out there in the waiting room, have their names written in big letters on their folders, and tell my clients, hey, when you get here, just grab your folder out of the big file cabinet out there and bring it in and hand it to me. And then when you leave, can you put it back? That would actually, I could make a very efficient system doing that. And I've seen systems like that in contexts that are not healthcare oriented. But I'm definitely not going to do that here for obvious reasons, right? I don't think your desire to use texting to save time is equivalent to that. But that kind of thing is what we need to think about. What the main thing is, you say, I want to use texting reminders because they save time. So what I need to do is think of how I can use texting, or how texting fits into my confidentiality picture so that I can use it to save time. That's what you need to do. And that's what makes it good. That's what makes it fine, right? And I think the other thing you want to consider there is, and what will I do if the client does not want it that way? Because that's an important thing to remember. For all of these things, client autonomy still must be taken into account. And so if the client says that's not what I want, when it comes to texting, you may need to comply and do it a different way. Just because, if they don't want it because SMS texting isn't secure, it is reasonable for the client to ask for something as an alternative. If you're using a secure texting method, one that that doesn't use SMS, that uses a secure texting app, like one of the proprietary messaging apps, and the client says, I don't want that, it may be perfectly reasonable for you to say, okay, you don't have to have that, but I'm not going to give you an alternative. Because the original offer you gave to them was to use a secure proprietary texting app, which meets all of your requirements legally and ethically. And so if the client doesn't want it, you don't necessarily have to give an alternative. Now, of course, appointment reminders are actually good for the practice in the agency. So I understand why you'd want to figure out an alternative, but it's not that you have to, right? If you're offering something in the first place that meets all your needs for providing a confidential and safe way of sending reminders. Another person asked, like, what if a participant sends a thank you message? Like, someone sends me a thank you message. Can we post that message on social media? I'm not going to get too deep into that, but posting testimonials of any kind is ethically very shaky, right? Posting on social media in general is going to be very highly shaky. So, like, if a client goes to a website on their own, like let's say they go to HealthGrades on their own, or they go to Yelp on their own, and they write a review of you, and they didn't talk to you about it, they didn't ask you about it, they just went and did it, right? In general, you can just leave those alone, and that's largely all right. Ethically, you're not likely to run into much trouble. But if you go post it yourself, you're more likely to run afoul of the idea of soliciting testimonials. And not necessarily just because you solicited the testimonial from that person who sent you the thank you note, but because by posting thank you notes and testimonials, you might be indicating to other clients, hey, maybe you should do this too, because it actually is a typical marketing method for a private practice or agency is to post thank you messages from past clients in order to encourage more clients to post more of them. However, I'll tell you right now, I've been hearing out of California some interesting legal moves because apparently the FTC made some rulings on this issue of therapists posting testimonials, and so that might change just because the FTC and the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, and other sort of federal forces might be pushing some changes on that ethical stance. So stay tuned there. Certainly at Person-Centered Tech, we're going to be investigating that. Automated reminder phone calls so someone asked, are automated reminder phone calls secure as opposed to SMS text message reminders? And this matters because a lot of practice management systems will send appointment reminders. Yeah, do you have a question? Oh, I thought I heard someone. So they'll send automated appointment reminders one of three ways. Either they'll text the person, like an SMS text, or they'll do like a robocall to the client reminding them, or they'll send them an email. Of those three, I actually, from a security perspective, my conservative choice among those three is the automated phone call. And the reason for that is just weird ways that HIPAA functions. It's not, I don't necessarily think it actually is more secure in a real technical standpoint to use an automated robocall, but the way the regulation is written under HIPAA, it is least risky to do a robocall. However, honestly, I'm going to talk right now about clients telling you that they want non-secure communications like texting and email. And if a client says to you, I want non-secure texting or I want non-secure email, at that point, using a text message reminder or an email reminder is just as safe for you as using the robocall. Like the robocall reminder is just a less risky default before clients give you their option, like what they want, in terms of like how they want to manage their own privacy in terms of their appointments. Okay, yes, we will talk about how, someone asked about how to document text messages. That's in today's section. Someone asked about Metro PCS. Metro PCS is, as far as I understand it, is a phone service. I believe Metro PCS is operated by Sprint, if I'm not mistaken. So that would be a standard phone service. I know in the section 1, I talked about different phone services, like classic phone services that used to be Ma Bell. How when you're using those, the way HIPAA works, HIPAA doesn't tend to expect you'll have a business associate agreement with that phone company. My comments earlier about that would also apply to Metro PCS. Yes, if that's what you're asking. Okay, so the big thing that someone asked that I really want to make sure I address is talking about unsecured messages versus business associate agreements. So just to make sure everyone knows what a business associate agreement is, I know I talked about it briefly, but I didn't describe in detail what that is. Where did I talk about it? Yeah, here we go. Okay, so I'm gonna discuss this slide in general a little bit more to help make sure that everyone understands that the ability that clients can tell you they want non-secure emails, they want non-secure text messages, and HIPAA says that they can make that decision. But if you then, at their request, start exchanging SMS non-secure text messages or standard unsecured emails with them at their request, under HIPAA, you're HIPAA compliant. You're not violating HIPAA by doing that. But here's the thing that you want to make sure you understand. So what we're talking about there, when we talk about the client saying, I still want that, we're primarily talking about this HIPAA standard. Now, the law doesn't specifically say this, but I'm going to use this to help simplify the way we think about this. Right? We're primarily talking about the client saying, I understand that SMS, unsecure texts, and unsecure emails, I understand that those things don't have this transmission security stuff attached to them, meaning like they're not encrypted when they go over the internet, for example. All right, the client's saying, I understand that. They understand that because you told them, like you have a responsibility to inform them about the fact that if you send them a SMS message or you send them a standard email, that it can be viewed by bad guys as it passes over the internet. or it can be viewed by other third parties. HIPAA says you need to make sure you tell them that. You could be working with Bill Gates and you still have to tell him that, right? It's still your responsibility to give that advice, even if the client is a technical expert, right? And the client says, yeah, I get that. I know what the risks are to the privacy, to my privacy, if I ask you to send me health information using an unsecure SMS text message or a conventional email, and you want them to sign that you inform them of the risks and that they still want it. You want that signed because you need documentation of the client's decision. And then it's acceptable under HIPAA that you go ahead and send them those messages, right? That's totally fine. But what we're talking about here is that they've consented to understanding the risks of the message being sent over the internet, right? That's different from the fact that, totally separate from, if you have when you send a text message or you send an email, you're employing a company to send that message or email for you. And when you receive messages, you receive SMS messages, you receive emails, you're employing a company to receive those messages for you. With an SMS message, it's usually a phone company. With an email, it's an email company like Google or something like that. Or for a lot of agencies, it might actually be an agency email setup that's supplied by the city or the county or something, right? Whoever is doing that, whatever company or third party is doing your texting for you or doing your email for you, right? That company is third party, and so you need agreements with them. Like your agency or practice needs to have agreements with that company that indicate that that company will maintain your security and privacy requirements. And that's called the business associate agreement. All right? So that's why even though clients may say, yeah, I want these non-secure messages, there's still one more piece to the puzzle. All right? You still need to make sure that the service you're using for SMS texting or for conventional email, you need to make sure the service provider who does that for your agency or for your practice, that they have entered into these HIPAA-compliant business associate agreements with you. So I'm going to go back to the question. So following up to unsecured message versus BAA, if you have unsecured communication with a client, you have to use vanilla SMS. You don't have to, but that is, vanilla SMS is unsecured, yes, which is a different provider than a secured private texting app. That's right. With whom it would have a BAA. So the point of the BAA with SMS is the fact that there is some company that is sending and receiving your unsecured SMS messages, and they are then privy to the messages. They are also responsible for making sure that they don't lose the messages, because the messages still have to be discoverable. Like you still have to be able to find the SMS messages that you've exchanged with clients. So you just need to use an SMS service that will give you a HIPAA business associate agreement. And I'll tell you right now, there are numerous ways to do that. At the end, I have several options of companies that do these various things. And there's a couple of good internet phone services that are good, very well priced for agencies and small practices that can handle SMS non-secure messages for you in a very secure way with business associate agreements. Okay. So very good question from Nicole, exactly the right question. If a client verbalizes they want texting reminders for scheduling stuff, do you need a physical written consent form? Do you need them to actually sign something? What's interesting, Nicole, is actually HIPAA does not require you to do so. HIPAA does not say you need something signed. However, I can tell you right now that if you're looking at something that's kind of high risk here, the client saying, yeah, go ahead and send me something that without my consent would be a violation of HIPAA's privacy rule. So you want to be able to have documentation that the client did tell you to do that. Because if you don't, you could end up in a lot of hot water, despite the fact that you're doing exactly what the client asked you to do, right? So basically, you want physical documentation because you don't want to get caught with your pants down, right? That's why you want that documentation. But you're right. I mean, the HIPAA rules don't actually even say you need a particular documentation, which is kind of interesting. So I'll tell you right now, I'm sending you all, this is one of the handouts, is our form that we made a person-centered tech that you can use to build your form for clients to request non-secure SMS texting or conventional email. Works for that too. This form, I built this to work as a HIPAA release of information authorization. I did that just for built-in suspenders. I want you all to know you don't have to go as far as this form goes. Like you don't have to get authorization level consent from a client to do SMS non-secure texting or conventional email. But I gave it to you that way just to really belt and suspenders covering your needs there. If you want it to even just be that, the person gets a blurb that says, hey, it says like, if you want us to be able to use unsecured text messages with you, be aware that the text messages your therapist sends you can be viewed by third parties on the internet or third-party administrators at phone companies or here at the practice. Please tell me please sign here if you still want us to send those to you. They sign. That's sufficient. Like that kind of thing I just verbally described would actually be sufficient for your HIPAA requirements. However, I've shared this form just to make sure you can get some nice belt and suspenders going on. So if you've got an attorney or a privacy officer at your agency, show this to them and have them, they can go ahead and use this as they desire to figure out what kind of documentation of consent would be good for your agency or your practice. So we also have Google Voice. Yes, this will be emailed to you all, I believe. I know I share these as handouts. I think everything's going to get emailed to you afterwards. Right. Yeah. Yes. So Dean's saying, fun fact, and Dean's right about this. Actual text messaging content is only kept by Verizon and stored for 3 to 5 days. That's usually true. AT&T leads other carriers by keeping data from 5 to 7 years. And the interesting, kind of a fun fact response to the fun fact, Dean, is that one of the things about HIPAA business associate agreements, one of the things that agreement defines between you and the phone company or you and your practice management system or whatever company you have this with, is it has to lay out what they're going to do with your data. Like they have to say, here's how long we will keep data. Here are the conditions under which we will delete data. This is actually one of the reasons, like what you're describing with the phone company is one of the reasons why we would rather work with companies that give us a business associate agreement if those companies are actually handling our client data like they would with text messages. So the fact that Verizon may only store your text messages for a few days, but AT&T might store them for years, like we don't want that variability and we don't want that kind of opaqueness. Like we want to know, what are they going to do with our text messages? Like we want them to tell us what they're going to do. And then we go, okay, that'll work for us. And that's one of the things the agreements help us do, right? Is just know how we're going to work with this company. Otherwise, we have these messages that contain sensitive info about clients. That's just, we're just leaving it up to this other company what they're going to do with it according to their policies and their choices. And that's actually the entire point of things like HIPAA business associate agreements, is to make sure that both parties, like you, the practitioner or the agency, and the provider of services, you're both on the same page about managing this private data. That's the idea. We don't always have that. I mean, especially if we're using a standard phone company, we may have to work without that on occasion. But as time marches on, it becomes easier and easier to only use services that enter into HIPAA business associate agreements. And one of my last slides, I have a couple options of internet phone companies that work really well with healthcare providers. Like you can check those out as an option. Yes, exactly as Dean says. Good to know ahead of time instead of after the fact. That's exactly the point. Right, exactly. Right. And then someone's asking about HIPAA or Google Voice. So Google Voice not HIPAA compliant with texting. Do you have suggestions for what clinicians can use if clients need access to an actual phone number while clinicians are working remotely from home? Oh, right, yeah. I would actually recommend, one of the things I have later is a recommendation of phone services. I'll show you that. But on that, if you're already looking right now for that, Cynthia, you can look at iPlum. iPlum, like the fruit plum. You will probably find that to be one of your best options for what you're thinking about. And Vicky's asking the difference between a BAA and a DEAA. I do not know what a DEAA is, so I couldn't tell you. But if they're in the same category of concepts, the DEAA is probably the equivalent of a BAA for a different regulation besides HIPAA. That would be my guess. It might be a state thing for New York. I know in Oregon, we just refer to those as RFPs, which is request for proposal. But then the term RFP continues to refer to the company that has entered into agreements with the state that are like the business associate agreement. Okay, so hopefully a big thing I've really communicated to you all here is that you can use texting, including unsecured texting, so long as conditions make it make sense and the client asks for it. And the big thing you need to be taking care of there is ensuring the client does want it and it's safe for the client to have these unsecured texts, and you're using a texting service that meets your HIPAA requirements, which really means this business associate agreement. Although the question about DEAAs that Vicki put in here, because Vicki's asking what's the difference between a BAA, which is a business associate agreement, which is a HIPAA concept, versus a DEAA, which I'm not familiar with. I don't know that one. But this also brings us to the last question from last time that I want to make sure I address, which is someone asked about 42 CFR Part 2, which is a federal rule often called the confidentiality rule. And it relates explicitly, I see, Vicki, thank you. The 42 CFR Part 2 relates explicitly to centers that do substance use treatment. And generally speaking, to qualify as for your agency to be under this, generally you need to be receiving federal funds to do substance use treatment. Although don't take that as the word on how you become under it, but it's important to note that just because you work with a client who have a substance use disorder doesn't necessarily mean that all your work is under 42 CFR Part 2, that particular federal regulation. One thing I will say, 42 CFR Part 2 is largely a privacy regulation, which means it doesn't say a lot about security issues. The thing I would say for those whose agencies are under 42 CFR Part 2 is when I'm going to show my request for non-secure communications again. This form that I'm giving you for the client to say, yeah, I want you to send me non-secure communications, what I would do, and this, by the way, is not necessarily a legal best standard or something, and it's definitely not something the law says you have to do, but I think it could be a good idea to do, is add to this those bits that you always add to release of information that have the person explicitly check whether it's acceptable to talk about their substance use treatment or their behavioral health treatment or their HIV or hepatitis status, which are the things that you specifically have to specify on a release form if you are covered by 42 CFR Part 2. So if you are covered by that, you might go ahead when the client talks about using non-secure communication with you, maybe also ask them, okay, please check off if you are fine with us discussing these points when we use SMS texting or conventional email with you. However, I would discourage them from checking those because we hopefully don't need to talk about those things when we text. But then again, that depends on what you're using texting for. Okay. Data exchange associate agreement. Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one, Vicki, in specific. But it does sound like it's, oh, I know what that is. Yes, that's, the differences there are very complicated. That's the best I can do. Sorry about that. Might have to save it. I might have to talk about that another time. Okay. So remember, back to, now we talk about that again. Remember, this is when you're thinking about using SMS. Remember, SMS is not physically secure. Like SMS messages can be intercepted or just read or misused by phone companies, which is why you want to make sure clients know, right, that SMS is non-secure. And you ideally won't use SMS texting unless there's no good alternative, right? So why would I use SMS? When would be a point when it makes sense to use it? Well, if the client doesn't have a smartphone or they can't install apps on their phone, then SMS is how you would text with them. If you need to be able to text with that person, SMS is what you have. In which case, make sure you're using a phone service that does SMS and does business associate agreements. Right, and make sure the client understands the risks of SMS, of non-secure communications, and they sign a form saying, yes, you've informed me of the risks, I understand them, I don't see these risks as a problem for me, I want my therapist to text with me, and I'm signing that I've been informed of those risks, and I still want non-secure texts, right? I'll answer that one a little later, Tracy. That's a good question about how do you get signatures when the client's remote. That's a whole other question, but I'll try, if I got time, I'll get into that with you. If the client wants appointment reminders, generally you have no choice but SMS, even if they have smartphones, just because the system that sends appointment reminders can usually only use SMS. If you are sending your appointment reminders manually, like you're just pulling out your phone and writing them, and you and your clients have a secure texting app, you should use the secure texting app, right? If your practice management system is automatically sending reminders, generally they can only use SMS. And appointment reminders are pretty low-level sensitivity, but high-level value. So clients often will say, yes, I want you to take the risk of sending me this private information using a non-private means, which is SMS, because I'm not worried about bad guys knowing that I'm going to a therapy session. I don't mind that, because that's the only thing that's going to be in those messages. And getting the reminders is so valuable to my therapy, I want to go ahead and take that privacy risk. If it's a client emergency and SMS is all you got, go for it. And of course, don't use SMS texting if the agency doesn't allow it. So if your agency doesn't allow it right now, talk to them, show them this presentation, show them some of the forms I'm going to send you, and I'm going to show you a little later, so they can help them understand that SMS may actually be a very reasonable thing to use if you follow these guidelines. Okay. Also, low SES people tend to need SMS if they want texting at all. And these are things to make sure to tell clients about texting, right? It's very important to make sure clients know that text messages are in their record, because text messages are records. Clients don't necessarily expect that, right? They tend to think of text messages as things that disappear off into the ether. People are becoming more and more aware that that's not true, that text messages linger. But definitely it's a good idea to make sure they understand that not only will the messages linger, but they linger in their health record, right? That it's part of their health record. Make sure they know third parties may be able to view their messages. Even if you're using a secure texting app, there may be other people at your practice who can view the messages. Or administrators maybe can view your messages, because the messages you exchange with clients need to be discoverable by the practice. So make sure clients understand that. Really importantly, make sure clients know how quickly you're going to respond to their messages, because that's a big deal to people. And when using SMS, make sure clients know those privacy risks. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about boundaries and professionalism. We do that real quickly, and then I'm going to talk about solutions, like specific solutions you can use, and how to use this form I gave you for building solutions. So major clinical ethical considerations with texting includes, how does mobile textual communication affect boundaries? All right, do consider that if you've got a phone all the time, and so does your client, and you're texting with each other, you're possibly inviting clients to message you at any time. Now, depending on the population you work with and the conditions you work with, and how well you set up boundaries from the get-go, that's really important. Depending on those three things, you may or may not have more boundary pushing from clients because you got this phone. Or you yourself may feel more inclined to push the usual therapeutic boundary. I definitely have seen stories of that before, where the therapist is, say, checking in with clients in ways that they normally would not do so if they didn't feel the looser boundary that comes from possessing a phone. Addressing multicultural concerns, how should you respond, and should you use personal devices? Okay, so reasonable boundaries. I'll talk, Mary will get to that at the end of the section. So what does it mean for the clinician-client contact locale to extend beyond the office walls, or physical or online, right? And so what I mean by this is our usual ethical boundaries, and definitely our trainings in boundaries back in grad school, tended to be based on the assumption that clients interface with us in our offices, or even in our online offices. We can still, extend it to that, right? And then they don't interact with us outside that, except for maybe a phone call. Like, our ethics and boundary training tends to be based on that principle. And when you get texting into the mix, we completely throw that off. Like, we become accessible to clients and vice versa all the time, right? So when you're looking at a virtual world, and I'm holding up my iPhone here, when I have my iPhone, I have connection and contact to everybody I ever talk to right here all the time. The entire planet is basically connected into this device I'm holding in my hand. When I did not have one of these, that wasn't true. Just by leaving the office, I suddenly disconnect myself from that connection. I no longer do that. This thing is literally sits next to my head when I sleep, right? It's on the little table next to my bed, right, charging. So this thing is always with me, and that's probably true of all of you, and if not all of you, most of you, and certainly true of our clients as well, even if they have older cell phones. Connection is always possible, and that has changed the way we think about connection, right? There's never a time when you cannot check in with somebody. Do you remember back when you had, if you wanted to go out with friends, you had to make plans, pick a time and place, and meet there? I don't know if any of you remember that, but I occasionally try to recall what that was like, and I can't remember that, right? Because we don't need that anymore. We can just say, hey, I'm heading to the place. Want to meet me there? Sure, I'll text you when I get nearby, because texting lets us just stay in communication with each other, right? So clients expect that as a norm. You may not expect that as a norm, no matter what age group you come from, or what your what your general a demographic makeup is, ethnic makeup, age makeup, all those things. Like you may or may not think that that boundary, that porous boundary makes sense for you as a therapist because you have ideas about how boundaries work with your clients. Remember, clients aren't therapists. They're not trained in boundaries like we are. Even people who don't normally push boundaries may not know what boundaries we need to set in order to do good work for them. So remember, it's up to us to set the boundary. Very importantly, it's up to us to help clients know what a healthy boundary is when it comes to between session communication. And here I have a little graphic that illustrates a common thought about texting that illustrates the idea that people expect responses when it's done quickly. So the image is from iMessage, which is the secure app that comes with iPhones, right? The messaging app. And it shows someone saying, hey, as a message. And underneath the message it says, hey, it says read, 2:37 p.m. And what that means is, like, the person who's holding this phone in this image has sent a message to someone else saying, hey, and their phone is telling them that other person that you just texted, they have read your message. They read it at 2:37 p.m. and they still haven't replied. And we call that being left on read. And so the caption on this image is, I hate being left on read when texting someone. And that's a concept that people have and talk about in the vernacular. Like, I've been left on read, or, I texted so-and-so, but it left me on read. What that means is you can see that the other person read your text and hasn't responded to you. And so suddenly you start wondering what that means socially and interpersonally. So if a client sends you a text, even if they don't get a little message that says you've read their message, even if they don't get that, right? Because you may set up your secure texting app not to do that. Or if you're using SMS texting, it doesn't usually have the ability to show if you've read the message, right? But either way, the client will eventually figure you've read their message. And if you're not getting back to them, what are they going to feel? How's that going to impact therapeutic alliance? Are they going to feel abandoned? Whether they feel abandoned or not will depend a lot on their expectations with text messages, as well as, say, how securely attached they are to caregivers, and how much anxiety they have and things of that nature. So if you're working with clients who have, who need that, who have an insecure attachment pattern, who are highly anxious, who have very volatile affect, many of them may find that a slow response to text messaging is harmful to the relationship, or at least they feel very upset by it. So it's good to set up from the beginning what the boundaries are. And remember that the kids these days are pretty prone to this. Like, they generally have grown up around having text messaging and seeing a quick response. It doesn't mean that all of them are pushy and don't understand the idea of boundaries. I mean, they can understand boundaries, but often you need to tell them what to expect, right? Often with a lot of the people, if you just say, here's what to expect, like, okay, great, you've told me what to expect. That allows me to settle and regulate if I don't get a message back from you, because I can say, oh, well, Roy's a therapist, and he told me, as a therapist, he doesn't just respond immediately. He's going to take time, or he'll only respond to my text messages during his office hours or something. If the client knows that, they're more likely to be able to regulate and self-soothe if they're feeling like they're not getting this response from me. If I don't tell them that, we're leaving it entirely to their own tendencies for how they manage self-soothing, which we don't want to do in this situation. We want to set it up ahead of time for them to understand what to expect. All right, so here's a poll. I want you all to just tell me, have they ever had a client get upset at your slow response to messages? I'm just kind of curious, and we can see from each other and learn about that. Here we go, there's the poll. And you can choose all that apply on this one. All right. Poll has ended. Great. Never come up for you. Okay. Got a couple people saying it's never come up. That's cool. So Janice says to communicate with families via text messages all the time sometimes. You have an iPhone, you're constantly being prompted to back up your phone. I'm kind of curious what you're being prompted by. It might be some software you have. If you're going to back up your iPhone, make sure you're using a backup method that is also securing things. Like, for example, a cloud-based backup I like is one called Spider Oak 1, like spider like the insect, oak like the tree 1. That's a pretty great way to back up iPhones and other computers, and they give a business associate agreement. So it's okay for them to handle those text messages that are in there. Okay, so I see, yeah, okay, more than half of you have not had it come up, but quite a few of you have. Okay, this is good to know. So it's not coming up a lot for you guys. That's a good thing to see, because that's useful for me to know with regards to what you're all facing. So in general, the big thing with boundary setting is office policies. One thing that you're going to get emailed to you is our sample communications policy. So take a look at this, use whatever you like from this form. It talks about the best ways to contact the therapist and like basically what we're going to use for contact and what we're going to talk about between sessions. And very importantly, it has at the bottom an address to response time. Like definitely tell clients like what kind of time frame to expect responses within. That's an important thing to make sure you set up with them. And I'll also say it's an ethical thing too. Like for example, the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics actually says you need to address response time in your informed consent with clients if you use technology-assisted counseling. And I also see that in the NASW technology guidelines. Though that's not the Code of Ethics, but the guidelines, they talk about telling clients about response time is very important. It helps maintain healthy boundaries in a way that don't damage therapeutic alliances. And so Michael's saying, yeah, you might get a different answer with relation to phone calls or emails. Absolutely. I think people expect faster responses if it's a text message. Still want fast responses to emails, but not as fast. And phone calls, honestly, a lot of people these days just don't even do phone calls. Like a lot of people may call, a lot of people these days, and it's not all people, it's just a lot of people, see a phone call as an indication that they should text the person who just called them, right? Like if they receive a phone call from somebody, they ignore the call, like just let it go, and then text them back saying, what do you need? That's actually a very common thing people do because they don't, a lot of people don't see talking on the phone as a normal, reasonable thing to do. And I won't talk about whether that's good or bad. I'll just talk about that's how a lot of people communicate. However, in my experience, I have found that counseling clients, therapy clients are often more willing to talk on the phone with their provider because they have an understanding that things work a little differently with their healthcare provider. But that's not always the case. Okay, personal phones and clinician boundaries. Okay, here's a policy thing I want practices and agencies to have in mind always, right? Like policy thing, okay. The difference between using your personally owned device. So I'm holding up my iPhone. This is my personal iPhone, all right? It's also my practice phone, but I'm in a solo practice. I'm the only person in my practice. I run everything myself, right? This is both my personal iPhone and an iPhone that I use in my practice. How do I manage that? Like, what are steps I take to make sure I'm not causing privacy breaches or causing boundary crossings by having personal life and work life on the same phone? Well, a little bit of it is just, me being thoughtful, right? But we can't assume I'm going to be thoughtful at 3 a.m. when I'm exhausted and I'm like, trying to respond to a text message from somebody, right? Like that's not likely to work. So the big thing I do to help make sure I don't have those crossovers is the apps on my phone that I use in my practice are separate from the apps that I use for my personal life. So like the normal texting button, like the app that I would tap to go to texting on this phone, that's all personal. If I need to text with clients, I have a completely different app for that. Same thing if I do a phone call. Like I have a different app for phone calls with clients than my personal one. And that's accomplished by what's called a soft phone app. And that's the second bullet here, right? The soft phone app is like a second app that a special phone company supplies to me, like a secondary phone company. In my case, I use a product called Ring RX. That's Ring like ringrx.com, like Ring RX, right? Like that's a company that gives me an extra app on my phone that gives me phone service and texting. It also gives me fax, although I use the fax from my computer because I can access my Ring RX account on my computer, right? Yeah, there's a cost. The one I use is $19 a month, but they also have a $15 a month version. There's a competitor for this company called iPlum, the letter I-P-L-U-M, like a fruit. And iPlum can cost as little as like $5 a month to have phone calling and texting as a separate app on the phone. Separate app on the phone. So when we're talking about agencies or practices where you need to use SMS, I strongly recommend that the agency or practice start adopting Ring RX or iPlum or their competitors, but those are the two that I like the most, Ring RX and iPlum. And iPlum is like someone asked earlier about being able to supply phone service to clinicians who are working from home during COVID. iPlum is probably your strong option for that one because iPlum is very inexpensive. It's very cheap. And the trade-off there is that iPlum has limited customer support, right? You have to tolerate the email-based customer support. That's how you get it so much less expensively. But yeah, this is what you want. I mean, we want the practice, like the stuff we do for clinical work should be on different apps, right? Separate from our personal apps. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of reasons for that. I have done like a little forensic work for a defense attorney who was defending a counselor who was being brought to a board case following a complaint from a client because the counselor had texted the client something from Facebook. And the client found it offensive and decided to complain. And the reason the counselor texted this thing to the client was because the counselors thought they were texting themselves. The counselor intended to text this thing from Facebook to themselves, accidentally selected the client, texted the thing to the client. How do you prevent errors like that? Well, you have your personal texting and your business texting, your practice texting in separate apps. Now, keep things separated. And the beauty is that if we use the right services, such as those online phone services, who have soft phone apps, right? Then we can keep the phone services separate from our personal phone services, but have one phone. Okay. The other thing we can do is the agency can give me a phone, like a second phone that belongs to the agency and can only be used for agency business. Now, most agencies would prefer the first one, where people use their own phones and we have separate apps. It's a lot less expensive, and your clinicians don't have to carry two phones around. Everyone's happy. But there may be some context for agencies where they'd rather give you their own phone. That might be the case. But I think we're moving towards a situation where it's just very easy for an agency to say, we're just going to use these services for practice business. You have to have those on your phone, right? And like you do not use your personal phone number. You don't use your personal texting at all to talk to clients. You use this service we hired. And that service we hired can be as little as like $5 a month per clinician or as much as $19 a month per clinician, but it's usually less expensive than traditional phone service. And very importantly, those phone services do HIPAA business associate agreements, right? And that's a big difference between like Ring RX, iPlum, the things I'm talking about that have a separate app. Big difference between them and Verizon or Sprint or AT&T is they have HIPAA business associate agreements. Classic phone companies usually do not, right? So there's a lot of reasons to go ahead and use those other things. And as Dean points out, it's also cheaper than a lawsuit. It's definitely cheaper than what that counselor's insurance, malpractice insurance, was paying for my services and the defense lawyer's services. I'll tell you that. All right, phone's with you all the time. Set boundaries. Yeah. All right, last one is documenting text. Okay. All right, so documenting texts. Here are examples. These are pull quotes from ethics codes, ACA, APA, NASW, and NBCC. Actually, that's not, sorry, APA and NASW, those are guidelines, not the ethics codes. But you'll see a general tendency towards a desire to document all your text messages, ethically speaking. NBCC, they're extremely explicit that you document every single text, including just text messages that are saying I'm running late, that kind of thing. So what does documentation look like? And HIPAA, of course, talks about that as well, because HIPAA talks about the need to maintain availability of information. Availability is another way of talking about discoverability, right? The agency needs to be able to retrieve the texts, right? So texts are records. HIPAA requires we protect the availability of PHI, like protected health information. Professional associations are inclined towards that as well. Courts might subpoena original text messages or emails, right? Because they may want that original text because it's available, right? And clients need to be informed that texts are part of their record because of things like this. Like, you know, if the records are subpoenaed and the client says, yes, turn over my records, that may mean turning over all the text messages you exchange, right? So retention strategies, there's a few ways to think about this. One is use a texting service that retains all your messages in a place where agency admins can see them. And those examples I gave earlier, RingRx, iPlum, those soft phone apps, they do that, right? Your agency can hire those services, have accounts for all the staff that need a phone number, generally all the clinicians in the agency, and the agency administrators can view all the text messages that are being exchanged. They can also see the voicemails, they can see call logs, because they're all in these centralized places. It's all there. You don't have to do anything special. It's just always there, right? That is ideal. If you don't have that, if you're using a more traditional situation, what you can do is if you can access your messages on your computer, or if you can access your practice management system or EHR inside your phone, which, you know, sometimes they have an app, you can do it in your phone. Copy the text messages, paste them into the client's record. Very, very importantly, do not email the text message to yourself. Don't do that, all right? Because you're taking private information and then emailing it to yourself, all right? Like, you don't want to do that. Like, if you're going to copy a text message and then place it into the record, you want to go direct from one thing to the other. So, for example, in my case, I have a secure email program called Hushmail. Hushmail is a secure email service. I have a Hushmail app on my phone, so I can access my Hushmail on my phone. I have my secure texting app. It's a secure app, but my secure texting app is not good at retaining messages for me. I have to do it myself. So whenever I have messages with clients, I copy those messages from my secure texting app. I paste them into Hushmail, a Hushmail message to myself. Hushmail is secure email, right? And then I have that, because Hushmail is a place where I actually store messages from clients, and so I have all my text messages from clients in my Hushmail, right? That's what I do there. You can also print using a wireless printer if that's an option. Not every printer has that as an option, but if you have a wireless printer and you can connect your phone to it, you could print your text messages, right? Don't send the message to yourself in an email. Like, don't do that. That's the big thing you want to not do. But once again, that top bullet is that's your top option, right? Is to use a service that just retains the messages for you and you don't have to worry about it. They're just always there. Like, an administrator could go to the RingRx account online or the iPlum account online, look up the messages that Roy Huggins has exchanged with clients, look for the phone number of the client that he's been seeing, and then just see all the text messages I exchanged with one particular client and print them or copy them over into something that they're releasing in records releases or whatever they need to do, right? That's your ideal. Okay, now creating texting solutions. So this is not really something to go into a lot of detail with, but I gave you all a form you can use in your agency or your practice or just for yourself to kind of write out your own texting solution. And it basically just lays out all the little things you need to think about when you're coming up with a texting solution and gives you a place to write everything out. And so, like, the first thing is the service provider, what company is doing that? Do you have a business associate agreement with them? And is it SMS, right? Or is it a secure messaging app? And in both cases, you'll notice for SMS and secure messaging app, for both of them, you'll see it asks, do you have a business associate agreement? And what's the effective date of your agreement, right? So it helps remind you about that. Then we talk about clinician devices. Are we using personal smartphones? Are we using agency smartphones? That kind of thing. Hardening refers to the idea of securing the device, which I have a link for on the slides about how to do that, right? How we use texting, down here is communication policy. Here you're building out what you're going to talk to clients about with regards to what you text about, right? So you can use this to build your communications policy. You're talking about how you're going to keep the records, and we're talking about technology choices. So the idea is that this form should guide you or an administrator or other person at your agency through the process of choosing how you're going to text with clients. What are you going to use? What software are you going to use? How are you going to use your phones and devices? What are your policies going to be about what you text about? What are you going to be talking to clients about? Right? You want to lay it all out there, and I want you all to see it's here. It is almost certain that every one of you can use texting with clients in some way or another that works for your legal ethical needs. Right? It's just an issue of covering your bases. Right? So remember, I want you to think about your texting as a solution, not like a program. It's not like, oh, we have the blah blah texting. Like, oh no, we use iPlum on personal devices, and then so-and-so helps everybody make sure their devices are hardened, meaning they're secured devices. And we have this office policy we give the clients to discuss with them what we text about. Like all of that together is a texting solution. And all of it together is what makes your texting program ethical or legal, right? It's not just one of those choices. It's all of them together that make it ethical or legal. And here are slides that lay out the pieces of the form in case you want to look at them as slide form, but they're also in the form. You don't need to see them here, right? And down here for your IT folks or for whoever is handling security of devices, here's a link to our article where we lay out the things you should do to a device to make sure it's what we call hardened, meaning it's got the security settings it needs, right? And so here we got some good proprietary messaging apps on the left. OMD, Tiger Connect, Spruce Health are all good options for secure texting apps. Your EHR, if it's got a client portal, that's ideal for secure texting apps. Or your teletherapy platform, like if your platform for video conferencing also can do messaging, it might have a mobile app, and you guys can use that for secure texting. Over here, those two I was talking about, RingRx and iPlum, that make really strong voice over IP, internet phone services that can have an extra soft phone app on your phone. So your phone can have a personal phone, separate from practice phone, all on the same device, right? And that's, so those are the worksheets we have. These are the names of those worksheets. And now it's Q&A. And I know, yeah, go ahead.
So this is Ann Cuppinger from CTEC. And before we dive into the Q&A and all rush off to our next thing, I really just want to thank you, Roy.
Yeah.
The blend of your experience as a clinician and your technical expertise is really just so welcome and so helpful. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to share all of that wisdom with us. And you've answered most questions along the way, but I'll just throw a couple other ones out there. Some are very specific. Does HushMail give business associates agreement?
Absolutely. And actually, if you go to personcenteredtech.com and go into one of our articles, you'll see ad banners for HushMail. If you follow the ad banner, you'll also get a discount on HushMail services.
There we go. Okay. And can a court seize your phone? Have you ever heard of a case where this has happened?
Yes, that's really complicated. Like they can seize your phone at the border, for example. That's a big deal. So people who travel internationally, I mean, we can't really right now, but often when they do, people talk about being careful of having sensitive information on your phone or computer when you're going through customs.
Okay.
But the big question is, if you are encrypting your device, which you should be doing, the big question is, can the court compel you to unencrypt it? And that's actually still a big hot button item or issue. Largely, they cannot, especially if you're securing your phone with a thumbprint because it's biometric. It's complicated. That's a whole lot of extra stuff.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, no, I get it. And the other question that two people are asking is, can you say something about how you get client signatures when you're working remotely?
Yeah, what you really need are, I did a whole presentation on that. There's basically two good ways. One is you have a practice management system that has a client portal, and that client portal has the ability to do forms, so that clients can go to your client portal and fill out forms. And then it has some kind of electronic signature in there. Some practice management systems, electronic signature is just checking a box. Be aware that legal electronic signatures is a really loose idea. Just nearly anything is legal as an electronic signature. The only question is whether, if the client wanted to deny that they signed the online document, you need to be able to demonstrate that they did sign it. So often if you're looking at a client portal, meaning the client had to go log in, they had to give their username and their password, and then they check a box saying they signed something, that usually works just fine because they're logged in. So you can say, you were logged in when you checked this box. I know it was you who checked it. So just FYI, that's useful. Hushmail also has a secure forms service where you can set up forms online, and they have, part of that is electronic signatures where the person can draw a signature and all that kind of stuff.
All right. We are leaving a couple questions on the table, but I have a feeling we may have you back sometime, especially to focus on sort of the clinical side of things.
Yeah.
But we do need to sign off. Everyone has reached the end of the hour. You'll get these slides, and all of these resource documents will be posted on the CTAC website, including a list of a couple of upcoming events. If you have further questions, please feel free to email us at CTAC. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for taking an hour out of their day to learn so much. And we really thank you, Roy, for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.